Have you ever wondered why some people command your attention with their mere presence, while you struggle to maintain control of your own conversations? There's a dark art to human relationships that few know and even fewer dare to consciously practice. An art that transcends words and penetrates directly into the core of our most intimate connections. Today, I will unveil to you the secrets that Niccolo Machiavelli, the supreme master of Renaissance political strategy, would apply to the intimacy of our personal relationships. I'm not talking about physical sexuality, but something infinitely more powerful. That silent control which dictates who truly leads every encounter, every conversation, every bond in your life. If you feel a shiver running down your spine right now, leave a like, because what you're about to discover could forever transform the way you relate to others. I will reveal ancient techniques that many powerful individuals prefer to keep silent, strategic, positions that don't just apply to the body, but penetrate to the very soul of the person in front of you. Prepare to see the invisible dance of power as never before. True power is never flaunted. It is wielded from the shadows, in absolute silence. Machiavelli understood this perfectly when he wrote The Prince, that dark and brilliant manual that has guided leaders and rulers for centuries through the labyrinths of political power. But what do his teachings have to do with your personal relationships? Absolutely everything. The first cursed position you must master is that of the silent observer. That strategic place where you learn to be silent so that others speak until they completely empty themselves before you. Imagine this. You're at a tense family gathering. Everyone is heatedly debating politics, religion, or that uncomfortable topic that always sparks division. The common position, the one your instinct would urge you to adopt, would be to immediately jump into the fray, passionately defend your ideas, raise your voice to be heard. A fatal error. Machiavelli would whisper in your ear with an enigmatic smile, "He who speaks first loses." The true position of power lies in that calculated silence, that apparent absence that makes others feel uncomfortably compelled to fill the void you've created. As they speak, they expose their vulnerabilities to you. As you remain silent, you accumulate invaluable information. In the intimacy of a personal relationship, this technique acquires an almost perverse power in its effectiveness. How many times have you felt that visceral, almost primitive need to explain yourself, to justify yourself to your partner, to prove you're right? It's a deeply ingrained instinct that pushes us to fill empty spaces with words, often words we later regret. Resisting that impulse requires ironclad mental discipline, but the results are astonishingly transformative. When you consciously and strategically adopt the position of the silent observer, you create a magnetic void that inevitably draws out the true intentions of the person in front of you. There is something unnervingly powerful in sustained silence. It generates an almost unbearable psychological discomfort, and in that discomfort, people unconsciously reveal their most guarded cards. I recall the case of Elena, a brilliant woman who applied this technique with her manipulative boss after months of enduring his denigrating comments and microaggressions. One day, she simply stopped reacting. To his usual provocations, she offered only a sustained gaze and an impenetrable silence that neither confirmed nor denied, that didn't fuel his need for conflict. 3 weeks later, her boss offered her an unexpected promotion. The void had created unbearable anxiety in him, and in that anxiety, power silently shifted hands without a single confrontation. This first position requires consistent practice. Your mind will scream in internal rebellion. It will desperately want to intervene, justify, explain, defend itself. Resisting that impulse is like holding your breath underwater. At first it hurts. It generates a sense of psychological suffocation, but then, paradoxically, it liberates. Start practicing with small everyday moments. When you're unfairly criticized, when asked something uncomfortable, when you feel the animalistic urge to defend yourself, breathe deeply 3 times and observe with scientific attention what happens in that empty space you have deliberately created. True intimacy, the kind that transforms and endures, isn't about saying absolutely everything as we've been led to believe, but about strategically knowing what to keep silent and when. Machiavelli would perfectly understand that the deepest power doesn't reside in who talks the most or shouts the loudest, but in who listens best from a conscious presence. For he who listens attentively knows. He who knows deeply anticipates. He who skillfully anticipates controls without the other even perceiving it. It is not malicious manipulation, but refined emotional strategy. And here comes the first ancestral secret that no one will ever reveal to you. When you master this first position with expertise, you discover something surprising about human nature. People don't truly want your words or your opinions, but your full attention, your complete presence. The majority of human beings are chronically hungry to be truly heard, to be seen in their entirety, to feel that someone understands them without judgment. Offering that sacred space of listening is the first step to silently becoming the gravitational center of any relationship. This strategic silence comes with an initial price you'll have to pay: apparent solitude. You'll feel misunderstood, as if you're betraying some unwritten social code that compels us to constantly offer opinions. Persist through that discomfort. It is precisely in that apparent void that you will begin to rebuild your personal power from unbreakable foundations. Because true power in intimacy isn't about dominating others through brute force, but about first mastering yourself with ruthless discipline. The most beautiful paradox of this first position is that, while others talk incessantly seeking power and influence, you acquire both precisely by seemingly renouncing them. In your attentive silence lies a strength that words can never equal, a presence that magnetizes and, without saying a word, communicates that you are someone who needs to prove nothing. And nothing generates more intrigue and respect than that silent certainty. The second cursed position introduces us to an even more complex and fascinating territory: calculated vulnerability. At first glance, it seems like an absolute contradiction, right? Machiavelli, that master of political strategy, would teach us that showing a certain weakness at the precise moment and to the right person can paradoxically become your greatest relational strength. Do not confuse this refined technique with the naive transparency that would leave you exposed. I'm talking about a strategically calibrated openness that completely disarms the other, while you firmly maintain control of the invisible emotional chessboard between you. In the deep intimacy of significant relationships, we all build elaborate defensive walls, layers upon layers of psychological protection that we've accumulated since childhood and believe to be impenetrable. The great paradox that few understand is that these very fortifications, designed to protect us, silently become our most suffocating prison. Calculated vulnerability consists of opening small, strategic windows in that wall, allowing the other to believe they've miraculously accessed your true self, your essence, when in reality you are meticulously guiding their perception to where you want it to go. Think of it as a sophisticated dance of shadows and light. If you always show unwavering strength, you inevitably generate resistance and competition in the other. If, on the contrary, you always show complete weakness, you inevitably inspire a subtle, unconscious disdain. But if you alternate both positions with refined emotional intelligence, you create a hypnotic rhythm in the relationship that proves irresistible. This technique works with mathematical precision because it activates one of our most primitive and powerful impulses: the instinct to protect and value someone who selectively shows vulnerability to us. Carlos, a brilliant negotiator in international conflicts, once confessed his best-kept secret to me. Before every truly important negotiation, I strategically share a personal concern with my counterpart, something absolutely real, yet carefully selected and controlled. I make them feel that they have privileged insight into me, that they've seen something few others do. This seemingly innocent act instantly creates a subconscious connection, an invisible bridge that facilitates subsequent agreements that seemed impossible just minutes before. Calculated vulnerability requires almost surgical discernment. You must precisely distinguish between what you can strategically share and what must remain hermetically sealed. There are three distinct levels in this technique: the public, what anyone can know about you; the personal, information reserved for those in your close circle; and the private, that sacred core that should only be accessible to yourself. The most common catastrophic error is to confuse these levels, excessively exposing what should remain private or obsessively protecting what could be strategically shared. This position has a transformative power especially notable in relationships that seem stuck in rigid patterns. How many times have you felt that invisible yet palpable wall between you and someone truly important in your life? The technique consists of carefully identifying a significant personal truth you can share, something that generates immediate empathy without ever compromising your strategic position. We are not talking about manipulation when this vulnerability comes from authenticity. It is strategic communication refined to the highest level. However, there exists an unbridgeable chasm between authentically calculated vulnerability and its crude imitation. The fundamental difference lies in the underlying intention. If your genuine goal is to create a meaningful connection while maintaining your integrity, you are on the right path. If, on the contrary, you are solely seeking to exploit others' empathy for exclusive benefit, you have gravely misinterpreted the lesson, and the outcome will eventually be catastrophic. Machiavelli, being more profound than many understand, would teach us that a strategy devoid of ethics eventually collapses under its own weight. What's truly fascinating about this second position is how it radically alters the invisible power dynamic in any relationship. Traditionally, we've been conditioned to think that showing vulnerability irremediably weakens us. The reality is infinitely more complex and nuanced. When you consciously choose which specific parts of yourself to reveal and when, you firmly maintain narrative control of the relationship. It is precisely like a masterful chess player who strategically sacrifices a pawn to gain a decisive position on the board that only he can fully visualize. And here comes the second ancestral secret. Calculated vulnerability inevitably generates a subconscious emotional debt. When you strategically open yourself to someone, you offer them a valuable gift, and that person unconsciously feels the natural obligation to reciprocate in some way. This reciprocity constitutes the molecular basis for much deeper connections, provided it is implemented from a fundamental authenticity. It's not about maliciously manipulating, but about wisely understanding the invisible flows that have governed our human interactions since the dawn of civilization. Consistent practice of this position eventually allows you to surgically precisely calibrate how much vulnerability to show in each specific context. You will develop a refined intuition about which parts of your personal story can serve as bridges of connection without becoming avenues of invasion. This calibration is not cold manipulation, but relational art at its highest expression. Always remember that calculated vulnerability doesn't consist of fabricating fictitious weaknesses, but of strategically sharing authentic parts of yourself that you would normally keep protected. Authenticity is precisely what gives this technique its transformative power. Without it, it becomes mere manipulation. And manipulation, unlike legitimate strategy, always leaves a trail of distrust that will eventually catch up to you. We arrive at the third cursed position, perhaps the most powerful and profoundly misinterpreted of all, the absent presence. Machiavelli, in his masterful understanding of human nature, perfectly understood that sometimes the greatest and most enduring power doesn't reside in being constantly present, but in knowing exactly when and how to strategically absent yourself. This refined technique operates on the fundamental paradox that we exponentially value what we don't have completely secured, what we could lose. In rigorously practical terms, absent presence means meticulously cultivating the art of strategic intermittence in your significant relationships. I am by no means talking about adolescent manipulative games, but about deeply understanding the natural rhythm of human desire and its inevitable cycles. Constant and predictable availability silently devalues your presence until it becomes invisible. Intermittent and strategic absence instantly revalues it. It's basic emotional physics, albeit counterintuitive. Magnetic attraction requires calibrated distance to generate the necessary tension that makes it sustainable. Think carefully about your most intense and significant relationships throughout your life. They probably naturally fluctuated between moments of deep, intense connection and periods of subtle distance that renewed mutual interest and appreciation. These cycles are by no means accidental or random. They respond to deeply ingrained subconscious patterns of attraction and repulsion that govern all our interactions. The transformative key lies in making them fully conscious, in masterfully directing that sophisticated dance instead of being unconsciously directed by it. I vividly recall the case of Martin, a charismatic and visionary leader who expertly applied this technique in organizational contexts. In truly critical meetings for the company's future, he deliberately maintained a low, contemplative profile during the first half of the discussion, almost as if he were mentally disconnected from the heated debate. When he finally decided to intervene, his measured words carried an absolutely greater specific weight that resonated throughout the room. His apparent initial absence subtly created a collective hunger for his presence and wisdom, turning his late participation into a significant event everyone unconsciously awaited. Absent presence operates simultaneously in three distinct dimensions: physical, emotional, and intellectual. You can be physically present in a space but emotionally distant, or vice versa. You can share your thoughts freely while keeping your emotions in calculated reserve. Each specific combination generates different effects on the relational dynamic. Truly mastering this position requires exceptional and refined self-control. We must disciplinedly resist the primitive urge to fill every awkward silence, to immediately respond to every message received, to be constantly available for every external demand. In deep romantic relationships, this technique takes on particularly complex and powerful nuances. It is, under no circumstances, about cruelly playing with others' feelings, but about essentially understanding that love, like elemental fire, imperatively needs space to breathe and renew itself. Suffocating dependence inevitably stifles, while conscious interdependence sustainably nurtures. When you practice absent presence with wisdom and compassion, you create precisely the vital space necessary for desire to naturally flourish. Instead of withering under the weight of predictable routine, the most common catastrophic error is to superficially confuse this sophisticated position with simple indifference or emotional manipulation. The crucial difference lies in both the underlying intention and the conscious execution. If your absence is fully conscious, carefully measured, and fundamentally stems from legitimate self-care, you are practicing an advanced and mature form of intimacy. If, on the contrary, you are only desperately seeking external control or narcissistic validation, you have irremediably fallen into the ego's trap that will eventually sabotage all your significant relationships. This ancestral technique undoubtedly has an initial emotional cost that you must consciously bear. You will inexorably face the primal fear of abandonment, the existential anxiety of not being in control, the initial vertigo of full autonomy and absolute responsibility for your experience. Stoically resisting that primitive urge is precisely the true inner work that transforms. Because in that seemingly empty and uncomfortable space is where genuine autonomy miraculously blossoms, both yours and the others. And here comes the third revealing secret. When you truly master absent presence, you discover with astonishment that the deepest and most significant relationships do not require constant, obsessive maintenance, as we've been led to believe. Like an exquisitely cultivated bonsai, they need occasional pruning and specific attention, not anxious and suffocating hovering. This liberating understanding unleashes vital energy that you can wisely reinvest in your personal growth, creating a virtuous cycle of self-discovery that paradoxically enriches all your relationships. The deepest and most transformative Machiavellian teaching here is that true and lasting power isn't in obsessively controlling the other from a place of insecurity, but in mastering your own patterns of anxious attachment and compulsive need with ruthless discipline. When you no longer desperately need the constant presence of others to feel complete and valuable is when, paradoxically, you become energetically more attractive and magnetic. Genuine personal freedom is, without a doubt, the most potent and enduring aphrodisiac that exists. Absent presence, when practiced from mindfulness and not from fear, radically transforms how you perceive yourself. You are no longer someone anxiously awaiting answers and validation, but someone who wisely manages your most valuable energy, your presence. This fundamental shift in perspective invisibly alters all your relational dynamics, even those that seemed completely stagnant or deteriorated. Begin practicing this position in low emotional risk contexts. Attentively observe how your strategic absence creates space for others to value you more consciously. Gradually, implement this technique in more significant relationships, carefully calibrating the distance to generate attraction without inciting abandonment. The balance is subtle and requires constant adjustments, but the results will permanently transform your understanding of relational power. The fourth cursed position submerges us into even more subtle and refined territories. The strategic mirror. Machiavelli understood with visionary clarity that people don't fundamentally respond to who you are in essence, but to how you make them feel about themselves in your presence. This masterful technique consists of consciously becoming a meticulously calculated reflection that shows others slightly improved and empowered versions of themselves, versions they secretly yearn to become. Let's imagine for a moment an absolutely common, everyday conversation. The vast majority of people talk anxiously, barely waiting for their turn to speak again, without truly listening. The strategic mirror begins precisely with genuine, active listening, but it goes infinitely beyond that. Fundamental base. You don't just attentively absorb what the other explicitly says, but you identify with almost surgical precision the unexpressed verbal yearnings, the parts of themselves they desperately wish to see validated and recognized. Then, with imperceptible subtlety, you meticulously reflect that ideal image they carry within. This sophisticated process occurs simultaneously on multiple layers of communication. First, you almost imperceptibly adopt superficial elements, specific verbal rhythm, characteristic body posture, unique breathing patterns. This subtle synchronization instantly creates a subconscious connection that bypasses rational defenses. Then, with greater depth, you reflect fundamental values and essential aspirations. If you detect that your interlocutor deeply values personal freedom, you strategically emphasize aspects of their discourse that show independence and autonomy. If they secretly yearn for professional recognition, you selectively amplify their achievements and potential without resorting to obvious flattery. Anna, an extraordinarily brilliant therapist specializing in complex cases, explained in detail how she ethically uses this technique in her professional practice. It is by no means manipulation when it stems from genuine empathy and a service vocation. We all have multiple facets, some luminous, others shadowy. I simply help my patients connect with their best potential selves by consciously reflecting them, allowing them to see possibilities that already exist within them. The crucial difference between destructive manipulation and constructive facilitation lies precisely in the fundamental intention that guides the technique. The transformative power of the strategic mirror multiplies exponentially with dedicated practice. Gradually, you begin to perceive extraordinarily subtle emotional nuances that are completely invisible to common observers. The slightest change in tone of voice, an almost imperceptible micro-expression lasting milliseconds, a specific word unconsciously repeated, all are valuable data that feeds your growing ability to reflect with extraordinary precision. This sharpened interpersonal sensitivity radically transforms the quality and depth of all your significant relationships. In competitive professional contexts, this technique generates surprisingly powerful alliances and unbreakable loyalties. Intense meetings, where others aggressively compete for attention and recognition, you elegantly reflect, while others impulsively interrupt. You expand and deepen others' ideas, adding substantial value without seeking immediate credit. This strategic positioning silently transforms you into the invisible catalyst of productive conversations, the silent architect of consensus. Truly enduring power isn't in egocentrically standing out, but in making others shine brightly while subtly guiding the overall direction from the shadows. Romantic intimacy reaches truly transformative depths with this refined position. We all desperately yearn to be seen in our entirety, not just superficially gazed upon. The strategic mirror allows you to see the other in their complex multidimensionality, in layers that perhaps even they don't consciously recognize. You don't just reflect the evidently visible but dormant potentials, silent wounds unexpressed verbally, yearnings barely whispered in moments of vulnerability. This extraordinary level of deep recognition creates bonds that radically transcend the superficial and ephemeral. However, this technique undoubtedly carries monumental ethical responsibilities that you must fully embrace. The mirror inevitably amplifies what it reflects. If you strategically reflect destructive insecurities instead of constructive potentials, you magnify devastating shadows instead of transformative light. Machiavelli would implicitly warn us across the centuries, with great power inevitably comes great responsibility. The mirror can heal old wounds or open them more deeply. It can uplift spirits or ruthlessly destroy them. Conscious practice requires deep and honest self-knowledge. You must constantly distinguish between your personal projections and the authentic reality of the other. Are you reflecting what you truly perceive or what you unconsciously wish to perceive? This crucial discrimination demands constant and relentless inner work, a brutally honest confrontation with your own unrecognized shadows. Because you can only reflect with crystalline clarity when your own inner mirror is meticulously clean of egocentric distortions. And here comes the fourth revealing secret. The strategic mirror eventually transforms you just as deeply as it transforms your relationships. You cannot constantly reflect the potential greatness in others without inevitably awakening your own dormant greatness. By attentively observing others' potential, you more clearly recognize your own unexplored potential. By validating fundamental values in others, we clarify and strengthen our own essential values. The conscious observer gradually becomes the observed, in a fascinating paradox of mutual and simultaneous growth. Machiavelli, being infinitely more profound than superficial history has conveyed, would understand this dynamic as the sublime culmination of true political intelligence, the extraordinary ability to influence without ever forcing, to guide without violently pushing. The strategic mirror represents relational mastery in its most advanced and refined expression, where authentic power no longer needs to be ostentatiously demonstrated because it flows naturally through mutual recognition and fully conscious resonance. This position, when practiced from authenticity and not from manipulation, generates a fascinating phenomenon. People feel inexplicably understood in your presence, even when you've spoken very little. They feel that with you, they can be more authentic and expansive versions of themselves. This silent power creates a form of natural authority that transcends formal hierarchies and endures when other types of influence have long since vanished. Begin practicing this technique by paying extraordinary attention to the specific words that people repeatedly use. These words are keys that reveal their internal mental maps. Subtly incorporate that same language into your response, creating a subconscious bridge of recognition. Gradually, expand this practice to include values, aspirations, and potentials you perceive in them. The art lies in reflecting without obvious imitation, in amplifying without distorting the authentic essence of the other. The fifth cursed position transports us to the fascinating and almost mystical territory of the unsaid, the transformative power of subtext. Machiavelli, in his profound understanding of human nature, perfectly grasped that truly meaningful communication silently occurs beneath the visible surface of exchanged words. This refined technique consists of masterfully dominating the invisible conversation that runs parallel beneath the audible conversation, that powerful underground river that truly determines the actual course of all our significant human interactions. In all authentic human communication, there are simultaneously at least three distinct levels of meaning: what is explicitly said with words, what is implicitly meant between the lines, and what is truly being energetically communicated at an essential level. The vast majority of people remain perpetually trapped at the first superficial level, mechanically responding only to the audible words as if they were the entirety of the message. True emotional strategists, however, operate simultaneously on the deeper, more significant levels, where true intentions, needs, and motivations are subtly revealed between the lines for those who know how to perceive these invisible patterns. Let's think analytically about a seemingly trivial couple's argument about who should wash the accumulated dishes. At the visible superficial level, it seemingly deals exclusively with everyday household responsibilities. A level deeper, it might actually be about mutual recognition and equitable valuation of the effort contributed to the relationship. At the deepest and most determining level, it might fundamentally be an existential negotiation about power, respect, and validation within the relational dynamic. If you respond exclusively to the first superficial level, you will indefinitely perpetuate cyclical conflicts without ever resolving them at their root. We have finally reached the sixth and final cursed position, the transcendent culmination of all the preceding ones, the magnetic void. Machiavelli, in his visionary understanding of the fundamental dynamics of human power, perfectly understood that supreme and most enduring power doesn't explicitly attract through brute force, but silently exerts an irresistible gravitational pull that makes others naturally orbit around it, seemingly by their own choice. This extraordinarily refined technique represents the masterful culmination of all the preceding ones, where you no longer consciously need to seek connection or influence because you have internally transformed into a completely natural gravitational field of attraction. The magnetic void operates under a deep paradoxical principle that defies conventional logic. The more complete, self-sufficient, and autonomous you are in your own essence, the less desperately you need external validation or connection, and, contradictorily, the more intensely others seek and value you. We are by no means talking about artificial emotional detachment or calculated indifference, but about authentic and profound psychological self-sufficiency. When you no longer existentially depend on external validation for your fundamental sense of worth and completeness, when your sense of value is genuinely self-generated from within, you naturally create an energetic void that others impulsively feel an urgent need to fill. This transcendent position isn't built superficially in days, weeks, or even months, but through deeply consistent and honest inner work that fundamentally transforms your essential relationship with yourself. It necessarily begins with the disciplined and rigorous practice of brutally honest self-knowledge, meticulously identifying your subconscious patterns of emotional dependence, your automatic mechanisms of compulsive external approval, seeking, your unconscious strategies for obtaining validation and recognition from sources external to yourself. Raoul, an exceptional mentor in holistic human development, eloquently described this transcendent state. After years of relentlessly honest inner work, I naturally reached a point where I no longer desperately needed to convince anyone of anything or constantly prove my worth. Paradoxically, it was precisely then that my transformative influence multiplied exponentially without conscious effort. People don't ultimately follow logical arguments or persuasive strategies. They instinctively follow authentic presences that radiate unshakable inner certainty. This existential certainty is by no means superficial arrogance, but deep essential clarity, complete alignment with your fundamental values and life purpose. The magnetic void radically alters all your significant relationships from the root. You no longer anxiously pursue, you naturally attract. You no longer laboriously persuade, you spontaneously inspire. You no longer strategically manipulate, you organically influence. This paradigm shift in relational dynamics inevitably generates fundamentally different relationships. People who connect with you out of authentic resonance and essential alignment, not out of psychological need or circumstantial convenience. The intrinsic quality of all your connections is completely transformed from its core. In the competitive professional arena, this transcendent position completely frees you from the exhausting, endless game of superficial impressions and calculated appearances. Instead of trying to obsessively and constantly prove your worth to others, you simply embody it silently in every action. Your work speaks eloquently for itself without the need for constant self-promotion. Your ideas are naturally valued for their intrinsic merit and real contribution, not for your ability to persuasively sell them. This fundamental authenticity organically creates a form of natural authority that no superficial technique can ever convincingly replicate. In intimate romantic relationships, the magnetic void definitively breaks destructive cycles of emotional codependency. You no longer desperately need the other person to be, act, or behave in a specific way to feel complete and valuable. This genuine inner freedom paradoxically generates infinitely deeper, more authentic, and more satisfying relationships. By not placing immoderate and unrealistic expectations on the other to complete your perceived deficiencies, you naturally create psychological space for genuine connections based on conscious desire, not compulsive need. The transformative path to this transcendent position is inevitably strewn with profound challenges that require courageous confrontation. You will inexorably face the primal fear of abandonment, the existential anxiety of not being in control, the initial vertigo of full autonomy and absolute responsibility for your experience. Each step on this path necessarily requires dismantling deeply ingrained limiting beliefs about your fundamental personal worth and your essential place in the world. It is literally a symbolic death of false identities historically built on dependence, to be reborn, transformed into fully conscious and freely chosen interdependence. Do not superficially confuse this extraordinarily refined position with emotional indifference or calculated coldness. The authentic magnetic void by no means lacks deep feelings. On the contrary, It allows them to be freely expressed from internal abundance, not from desperate scarcity. You love deeply not because you pathologically need to be loved to feel complete, but because you have abundant love to freely give. You contribute generously, not because you anxiously seek external recognition, but because you have intrinsic value to naturally offer, without expectations of return. And here comes the sixth and final transformative secret. The magnetic void is by no means a superficial technique that you mechanically apply from the outside, but an authentic state of being that you organically cultivate from within. You cannot convincingly fake it for long. You can only genuinely manifest it from your essence. It is the natural and inevitable result of consistently honest inner work that has fundamentally transformed your essential relationship with yourself and, by natural extension, with everything around you in the world. Machiavelli, being infinitely more profound and visionary than superficial history has conveyed, would perfectly understand this as the most refined and elevated expression of authentic power, that which no longer needs to constantly prove itself, which simply is in its essence. In this transcendent position, you definitively transcend the reactive dynamic of control and submission to permanently inhabit a space of natural influence based exclusively on your fundamental authenticity and genuine inner authority. You no longer need artificial techniques because you have organically become the embodied technique itself, a living, transformative field that silently but irrevocably alters any relational ecosystem you inhabit with your mere conscious presence. This culmination represents relational mastery in its highest expression, where power is no longer something you laboriously exert, but something you naturally emanate. People feel your presence before you speak, recognize your authority before you demonstrate it, respond to your essence before knowing your credentials. You have completely transcended the superficial game of appearances to permanently inhabit the deep reality of authentic presence. The path to this mastery is long and challenging, but every step in this direction immediately transforms the quality of your relationships. Begin simply by cultivating daily moments of genuine autonomy, where your well-being doesn't depend on specific external circumstances. Attentively observe where you compulsively seek validation and recognition. Consistently practice internally generating the emotional states you usually seek to provoke externally. Gradually, step by step, you will naturally find yourself inhabiting the magnetic void, not as a learned technique, but as an authentic expression of your inner evolution. You have reached the end of this transformative journey through the deepest shadows of authentic relational power, but in reality, this is merely the true beginning of your transformation. These cursed techniques I have shared with you are not simple mechanical strategies to superficially implement. They are relentless mirrors that reflect who you truly are in the sacred intimacy of your significant relationships. Like a surgical precision emotional scalpel, they can heal ancient wounds or inflict irreparable damage, depending exclusively on the hands that wield them and the intention that guides them. The crucial question you must ask yourself right now isn't superficially whether you can technically master these sophisticated positions, but deeply whether you are truly willing to bravely confront what you will inevitably discover about yourself when attempting to consciously implement them in your life. For he who doesn't dare to look directly into the eyes of their own darkest shadows will inevitably unconsciously project that primal fear onto all their significant relationships. True transformative power has never truly been in external techniques, but in the absolute congruence between your visible actions and your invisible essence. If you have felt that visceral shiver of recognition while listening attentively to me, if something deep within you has stirred uncomfortably, as if waking from a long slumber, you are genuinely ready for the next transcendent level of relational consciousness. Comment now.